Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. Today, we have a very special guest, Jason Brett. And I always say he is in the thick of things. He is in the belly of the beast. He's in the Imperial City, and he's involved in the whole regulatory battle. So I always really appreciate his input, especially on things that are happening in Capitol Hill. In regards to Bitcoin, we know that a lot of things have been happening very, very quickly over the last couple of months. I feel like things are accelerating. So really looking forward to this conversation. But before we start the show, I want to give a shout out to the awesome Bitcoin companies that make this show possible. Of course, you guys know Swan Bitcoin, best place to build your Bitcoin stack. It's built by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners. They also released a new product, Swan IRA. Definitely want to check that out. If you know, put your Bitcoin in the Swan IRA. And if you have any questions, you can always send me a Twitter DM. And of course, Bitcoin 2023 is going to be the largest Bitcoin conference on the face of the earth, hosted Miami Beach, Florida, May 18th through the 20th, 2023. And we have a very special promo code for you guys. We got your back. Promo code SIMPLY. Hope to see a lot of you guys in person, in the flesh, at Bitcoin 2023. Promo code SIMPLY. Jason, no more delay. How you doing? How's everything? How's life treating you these days?
Good. I was actually just over in England, in London, visiting some family, and also was on Peter McCormick's podcast, and that was fun. His soccer team's doing very well, so he's excited about that. But glad to be back in the stateside on this side of the pond, and there's just so much to cover. So, but yeah.
Yeah, 100%. So it's something that I've been meaning to ask you, right? So I had Caitlin Long on, I think it was 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she said something that I had a suspicion of, right? But, came from the horse's mouth, so to speak, because we all know that that Caitlin Long is, she's trying to get a federal banking charter which would make her competitive with other banks. And she was denied that banking charter. And she said on the pod that those orders came directly from the White House. They came directly from the top. And if you connect this with the recent White House report, the economic presidential report, they dedicated over, I think it was around 20 pages to basically making the case as to why central banking is necessary, why a CBDC, should be considered in the future, why you need the state for money, and why something like Bitcoin, cannot be used as money. And they mentioned something also about the Uniform Commercial Code, right? Which we also know is a mechanism that they've been trying to pass laws all around the states. Ron DeSantis actually mentioned it by name, the Uniform Commercial Code, when I think he did a press release specifically advocating against central bank digital currencies. So what's going on there? What do you know that we all don't know?
Well, I can tell you there's definitely interest in a central bank digital currency. I think it's been made clear that the likes of Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen, all the way to the Fed Reserve Chair, Powell, that to them, the solution for quote unquote crypto, right, is to introduce what is really a liability of the government, so that essentially they can move from the analog world of cash and dollars into the digital world. If you think about that for a second, it's kind of a copycat kind of approach, and it's not very innovative, right? It's really trying to maintain the status quo. And what I would say is, you saw Congress come down on Facebook, if you remember, when they tried to make their own digital currency, Libra, in 2019. What was Facebook doing? They were censoring, ads for other coins. They weren't letting anyone advertise anything else. And then because they thought they're saying this is bad. And then they go ahead and they introduce their own coin. The government comes in and says, no, what you're trying to do with this global stable coin, Libra, is bad. We're not going to let you do it. Beat up Facebook for a year or two. Facebook deserves to be beat up, let's face it. But Now we have the government who is not letting anybody do anything, saying, okay, well, wait a minute, we need to create our own currency. What's more disconcerting, and I think that this is so interesting, and I'm glad that I'm sharing this on your show, because we just had Robert Kennedy in California, the nephew of JFK, come out on Twitter a couple days ago, explaining that in his mind, FedNow, which is instant payment system that the Fed has been supposed to set up for like the last 5 years, is basically a backdoor of the U.S. government to seize everybody's Bitcoin, just the way FDR seized gold in the 1930s. So it's very interesting times to have a Democratic competitor to Joe Biden, a Kennedy of all people, to give us a little hope, to try to shed some light on the direction of just what's one administration, right? What's one administration's aspect. This doesn't mean this is forever. Luckily, we got rid of the whole king thing back in 1776, so we can have different leaders every 4 years and maybe change the approach that we have. But right now, the approach of this government, it's not very innovative. It's restrictive. But the one thing that they can't crack is Bitcoin. And more, I've been thinking Bitcoin is a lot like the Constitution. It's really laid out in a way. It's very similar to our democracy. No one can say no to you to owning Bitcoin. There's certain elements that if our democratic leadership, whether with a small d, for either the Democrats or the Republicans would take a step back and look at it, it's really the most democratic form of money we've ever been able to have. So we're kind of faced with a choice. Do we want to go down the road of something that's less innovative and more restrictive and could create opportunities to either, do Fed now and then seize people's Bitcoin? Or do we want an opportunity where we give people the opportunity to hold their own, coin of choice, preferably Bitcoin, and realize that this is a protocol that, you can make it miserable for people to try to hold it, but we have the protocol to do it.
Yeah, 100%. And Jason, I want to, you said something really interesting there, and I really want to double back and focus on that. And I never saw it that way. And I did see, we actually tweeted that out from the Simply account. Shout out Joseph and Opti. When when the Kennedy, I forget his first name, made that announcement. But you said that it was basically being used as an instrument to take everyone's Bitcoin. Could you describe the mechanism? Do you mean basically like getting people into using a central bank digital currency, and in the process of them doing that, distracting them from adopting something like Bitcoin, of which they can't control?
Well, if this is where it's important to understand, the government thinks of a CBDC as real-time payments, like in terms of a faster payments network, as well as something that you use to buy and sell things. They don't really see it as a savings mechanism, right? So what I believe the new candidate is looking at, I think it's Robert Kennedy. Please double check me on that. But is saying here is, if the government comes up with a real-time payment system that's faster than 10 minutes, right, for the next block or 6 blocks. So you've come up with something, quote unquote, faster than Bitcoin. Everyone can use it. And I think, to your point, yes, there's the distraction element of it, but then there's also the element of saying, there shouldn't be a competitor in money to the U.S. currency. This has always been sort of my fear about where this government's going, with saying, you can't have anything unless it's U.S. dollar based to use in society. There isn't room for alternate currencies. Technically, only Congress is allowed to, coin money. So I think that's where he's going with it. I don't necessarily think he believes that it's going to turn into the next digital gold, or maybe he does, and he thinks that they would do a similar seizure. But if they come up with a real-time payments network and everybody's happy with it, it's more than distracting with it. If we go back to the 6102 times, you had people who couldn't use gold to buy things with in transactions, right? It was illegal. And so, what I think he's saying is this administration is moving toward the potential of saying it's illegal to transact in Bitcoin.
Yeah, and it sure feels that way, right? Nick Carter wrote a great piece called Operation Choke Point 2.0, basically describing all the ways of which the administration is basically trying to isolate the industry from the legacy financial system. But what you're describing, and I'm hearing this for the first time, it's a step above that, right? So what this clearly feels like it's coming from the top echelons of government. This doesn't feel like it's coming from Congress or whatnot. Isn't it beyond their purview of the White House? What about the division of powers, right? Isn't it up to Congress to make that type of decision? Or are we looking at a scenario like the 30s where, FDR executive ordered it first and then, got the Supreme Court to say, okay, this is legal, this is constitutional. And then eventually it was Congress that made it possible. But at the time, due to the Great Depression, the Democrats had a supermajority in Congress. So it was a lot easier to pass that type of legislation. Would it be wrong to say that it would be a lot more difficult with how the current political structure is today, where it's basically a divided Senate almost, right? And the Republicans barely have power in the House. So what's their plan here? Like, what's their long-term play?
So I think to talk about for a minute your part about on the executive side, and this goes a little bit to what you were saying with Caitlin Long said the orders came from the White House. There's many parts of the White House, right? There's the Office of Science Technology Policy that's like concerned about Bitcoin mining. There's cybersecurity, which by the way recently came out and made a statement that was interesting that affects us. And then there's others. The key is that the Federal Reserve is supposed to be an independent agency of the White House, right? They're not supposed to be in lockstep. They're supposed to be separated. But if you think about it from the executive side, there are limits. They're not allowed to make laws, right? They have to do within the Constitution. But when it's an issue of national security, again, it was executive order. It started 6102. It eventually was passed by Congress, but it was an executive order based on national security that we needed to keep the gold here in America. So if you think about it from that perspective, one thing that's important to understand, I think, is that now with where we are today, and I've been thinking about this a lot, and I'm glad I'm getting to share it with you on your show because it finally kind of crystallized in my head what the directional where they're attacking this, why they're attacking this, why they believe what they need to be doing is correct. And it's less about like introducing a CBDC and more about fears about national security relating to illicit finance in compliance with BSA laws. It's actually interesting. When you talk to people in the White House or in Congress, they don't know the difference between Bitcoin and crypto. They also don't really know the difference between crypto and DeFi. Just recently, the Treasury issued a report on DeFi, and this is very interesting. So this report came out about a week ago, but all the problems with decentralized finance. It says no one really has a definition of what decentralized finance is. It also says even the industry can't define what decentralized finance is. It then says, as we all know, there are a lot of decentralized finance entities that are centralized, right? And what is interesting and where I think this ties together is there's also now been comments and concerns about the smart contracts that are used and the potential bugs that they might have, making the potential for other countries to quickly get money, not just from Bitcoin, but from Ethereum or whatever. And if you think about it, think about Tornado Cash. Remember that? It was a Bitcoin mixer, and they said it was helping the North Korean government get cryptocurrency. And I've been looking at this a lot, and if you look at some of the evidence, it's clear North Korea is using Bitcoin. They're accumulating it just like they accumulate any other thing, but they are accumulating it now. It's a very small portion of it, and the sort of the the evidence suggests that they're using it to potentially buy, increase their nuclear weapons arsenal. Well, that's a problem, right? And I think, and I've said this before, and I'll say this again. I think this is where for Bitcoiners, we have to have just a little bit of room for some maybe roundtables or critical thinking about, well, as Bitcoin increases and everyone starts using it, that means there might be some countries that start to use it, but in a very negative way, just like with any source of value, right? So, but my point is that when we've been talking about this like crackdown, right? This choke point. It's a choke point like on crypto, but it's not really crypto that they're talking about. They're worried about decentralized finance, and that's what they're worried about with Tornado Cash. The CFTC did an interesting ruling on what was the Oki DAO, on a DAO saying, first of all, the DAO is liable, but this Oki DAO situation was basically a company that said, hey, we're going to be centralized. We're going to be decentralized. We're going to go into DeFi. And because we're doing that, regulators can't touch us. Well, they wanted to make it clear that even DeFi is like a financial institution. And so the reason I'm sharing all of this is that in my mind, and with this latest Treasury report that really attacks the DeFi ecosystem, we have to understand, is DeFi, is Bitcoin DeFi, is it in that category? Because right now, what they're saying is all these other elements that are centralized are essentially financial institutions that have to comply with the BSA. But as we know, for Bitcoin, the good news is there's no way you can ask the Bitcoin protocol to comply with BSA and AML rules like a financial institution. So that's the rub, and that's where we're at right now. I think a lot of what you're seeing, the crackdown, is being driven from this national security element, because at the end of the day, Nico, it's about what they don't know. And it's a lot of fear, because it isn't a substantial amount of money yet. But there's this idea of the money moves so fast. It's almost like the answer is to education, right? Educate what Bitcoin is, how it works, what it does. Where since 1970s, we've developed this concept that we have to do BSA. It started with the drug trade. People in the Treasury used to take whole bags of cash and briefcases of cash if they had one little bit of cocaine on a dollar bill. Now everybody has it, and they got over it and they stopped doing that. Then there was sort of the Patriot Act after 9/11, where it's even more important. We have to know if the person's a terrorist, whatever. And I think we have to come to some sort of understanding in this country in this decade to decide, what do we need to do to keep us all safe? But what do we need to do to keep living in a free country and not feel like, if I just want to have a little bit of Bitcoin to save for my family, or I want to use some Bitcoin on a Lightning transaction and buy some stuff, that we should be able to do that, especially on a peer-to-peer basis. But I think it's important to understand that, to me now, the main attack is from the angle of DeFi. That the government does not want DeFi because it does not see how it can comply with the BSA rules.
Yeah, and it's Jason, look, I don't see a way where their systems of control, right? Their ability to control the money flows, right? In a lot of the justifications are exactly what you said, right? The illicit finance, terrorism, the North Korean example with Tornado Cash, that was used as a justification by the Office of Foreign Asset Control to sanction open source software, right? But at one point, something's got to give, right? I think eventually, unfortunately, DC is going to have to get used to the fact that they're not going to be able to control money the way that they've been able to control it for a very long time, right? Bitcoin, there's a saying, right? Bitcoiners say this all the time. Bitcoin is the money of enemies. Iran's going to use Bitcoin. Russia's going to use Bitcoin. China's going to use Bitcoin. North Korea is going to use Bitcoin. You can't stop it. Opti always says, right? You can't ban yourself from Bitcoin. You can't ban Bitcoin. You can only ban yourself from Bitcoin. Is that a pill that they're even could they even comprehend swallowing that type of pill, right? Or are they going to go through this very, tumultuous, painful process of And sometimes you can even say that there might be a knee-jerk reaction, right? Like look at the recent bill that was introduced, the Restrict Act, the TikTok ban, right? It's another power grab. A lot of people are calling it Patriot Act 2.0. So from you being in your position, Jason, is that even a pill they're willing to swallow? Are they ever going to be okay with the money of which not only can they not control, censor, seize effectively, but they can't even deflate it? Are they ever going to be okay with that, or is this going to be this very long, painful process of the 5 stages of grief, right? The 5 stages of denial. Is that where it's going? Like, what's your opinion on that? There's going to be an inevitable clash. I don't think Bitcoin is compatible with current U.S. sanction policy. I don't think they'll be able to sanction countries effectively the way that they've been able to do so for a very long time.
I can't disagree with that, right? I mean, this is what you have when you have a global currency. And I don't think I think it's a bridge too far. And the analogy I use is, when Great Britain dominated the world, it was based on their navy, right? Ships. And as that stopped being a thing, it was too hard for them to move to what else might they need to use to sort of dominate the world. The U.S. has dominated the world primarily with their economic power, along with the military power. And because the economic power is part of the playbook of foreign policy for the U.S., where there's the justification of sanctions based on the idea that I can sanction so I don't have to send soldiers over to die. Instead, we can just sanction a country. It's become, this norm, this practice. So, I don't see it. And this is why. So if we rewind back to the beginning of 2022, remember we were in our wonderful, everyone calls it the summer, right? Not crypto winter or whatever. Everything was booming. But in the beginning of that year, if you remember, there was that executive order that came out to start to study cryptocurrency by Biden's administration. People were starting to say, well, wait a minute, like we need to do things. There's certain principles. And this was discussions, Nico, between the Fed, Treasury, White House. And they basically came to the conclusion that there were 3 things that were principles that they would not let stand for, no matter what became of Bitcoin or crypto. Number 1, that it's up to the Federal Reserve and the government to set monetary policy. No one else, no algorithm, nothing else but the government is supposed to set monetary policy. That's number 1. Number 2 is to regulate financial institutions. And you see that now with this idea of we can't have Bitcoin in the banking system. We have to be able to have safety and soundness, and we have to have compliance, consumer protection. So we need to make sure it's a safe and sound financial system, so the financial markets work effectively. And then at the same time, we need the consumer protection so we can protect consumers, particularly disadvantaged consumers. So you have your monetary policy, you have your financial institutions and safety and soundness and consumer protection. And the last part is illicit finance. They will not tolerate the idea that a system of money could be taken advantage of, which is, I have to chuckle a little bit because it's not like the US dollar is insulated from sanctions. Even though they have all these sanctions in place, we still know there's still millions of dollars. There's issues with large banks. Remember HSBC from a while back. So, even the US dollar is not perfect, but this idea of, that they can't see, illicit finance run rampant. So when you think about that, what I just shared, those principles, that's basically the Fed, Treasury, White House said, this is how I have to do it. They saw executive order that came out in March. They decided that would be the vehicle they would use. And then if you look to September of 2022, you then saw, they said, here's our framework. Talked about, stopping illicit finance, CBDC. The CBDC is their answer for saying that we, the government, get to set monetary policy. By the way, just so your listeners don't get confused, this is not me saying that's correct. I'm saying this is what their belief system is. And then finally, you saw the crackdown, the choke point 2.0. And that to me is that principle number 2, of like, not making sure the safety and soundness of financial institutions, banks, and our financial system, isn't affected, that we can regulate them. So when you think about that, all of those together, I think you kind of have your answer. And it's funny, I'm thinking of like that movie I, Robot, right? These are the three principles we live by. But that's really where they're coming from. And I don't think that, at least in this administration, and the national security forces involved, they're going to back down. It's easy to forget we have NSET in this country now. NSET is the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team for the Department of Justice. They're looking at our whole ecosystem every day, and there's cases we probably haven't even heard about where they're ready to file in New York courts, whatever. There's active work at the FBI looking at cryptocurrency. This is the apparatus, the deep state, really, at this point, that is fully integrated into watching over this specific developments that happen in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, based on the need to protect from illicit finance, safety and soundness of our financial institutions, and the one that really is hard to swallow, but I think goes back to the very beginning, what we were talking about, which is CBDCs, right? CBDCs, so they can set monetary policy. Think about it. The CBDC might have an element where if you get CBDC, they might at some point decide to charge interest on your CBDCs for you holding it as a lower bound of setting monetary policy. So if like you have 300 CBDC dollars in your wallet, and they decide you need to be spending that money to help the economy, they might say, okay, we're going to take 3 of your CBDC dollars away every month as a charge, unless you spend it. I mean, it sounds more like a cattle prod, right?
It's total totalitarian control. Like there's no which way. Like it is every tyrant's wet dream to have that type of power. And to be frank, it's un-American. It's completely un-American. That enforcement. And but here's the thing, Jason. I think this is what gives me hope, right? Is that this only works. This plan works. Like this, this extravagant plan. You mentioned the deep state. I would call it the administrative state. It's right up in your grill. It's right up in your face. They're not hiding it anymore, right? This only works if people choose to use that currency. Like people just like, for example, in my case specifically, I refuse to ever use, as my primary unit of account, I refuse to use dollars if I don't have to. How are they going to force millions of individuals all around the world? How are they going to herd them into using a money they don't want to use? And the example that comes to mind is what is happening in Nigeria, which I think is a fascinating case study, where, they tried to roll out the Naira, which is the central bank digital currency of Nigeria, extremely low adoption rate. And the Bitcoin adoption rate, specifically in the younger generation, it's 30 to 35%. People don't trust what the guy in the suit on TV has to say about what money they should be using, what money they shouldn't be using, right? So this whole plan for the unelected bureaucracy that remains in power regardless of what political party is in charge, it all stems on people being like basically forced to use that currency. But I think the problem that they're going to have is every single day people are waking up to the fact that there's an alternative, and that alternative, it not only is it censorship resistant, right? Not only is it very hard to seize, it's also deflationary, increases in purchasing power over time. So they have a very difficult problem on their hands. And the reason I'm saying this, Jason, is because in all those documents, and I know that you've read them all, right? They always mention efficiency of payments. That is what they double down on. Efficiency of payments, efficiency of payments. We must make payments digital. But they never touch upon inflation. They never mention it. And I believe the reason that they never mention it is because they can't mention it, because if they were to mention it, it would validate the fact that money can exist without inflation. And if money can exist without inflation, forget about the $1 trillion deficit spending that the government gets away with every single year. Forget about the endless wars. Forget about the social programs that you might not necessarily agree with. They can't afford that with tax revenue alone, right? So I think that they have a big problem in their hands, but that doesn't mean that they can't make the lives of Bitcoiners, specifically in the US, a living hell in the process.
Yeah. I mean, and that's what I think, at least what I'm hoping to try to figure out is working with our current Congress and those that are allies to Bitcoin, because there are allies that exist, to make sure and protect certain rights, I think, that people need to have so Bitcoiners can be protected. It recently came out in Texas. I know there's a couple bills you want to talk about in Texas, but there was a resolution that I wrote, and not with Natalie Smolenski. Natalie added it in after I started it and brought it, did amazing work to bring it to the finish line. But it was a resolution for Bitcoiners, and it was introduced in Texas. And the idea of the resolution is actually, for me, like, that was a sort of the first stage of something that I think needs to eventually happen. So basically, it talked about we need to protect, the property rights of Bitcoiners, the right to code, that should be freedom of expression, and, the right to transact in Bitcoin, and also the right to have privacy with our money. And there's a bunch more, protecting Bitcoin miners and things like that in this resolution. Now, it's just a resolution. It doesn't actually affect any laws. But what I'm hoping Texas thinks about, and maybe the US thinks about, is, and I know this is like, seems ridiculously impossible, but I do think we need to have a constitutional amendment to protect Bitcoiners. And I think that at some point or another, we have to put into law protections about our rights to hold the property, hold Bitcoin, rights to have privacy related to that, rights to transact in it, and, ultimately right to code and to do these things that are freedoms of expression. Revolutionary War 1776 was a lot about what kind of money we were going to use. And, colonists couldn't use coins. They had to use the Spanish dollars. And, it's hard to know exactly what Satoshi Nakamoto was thinking. I know we always think about it talks about during the financial crisis, what he came out with. But I always think about the fact that Bitcoin has 8 decimal points to it, right? And if you think about pieces of 8, so, piece of 8 is the Spanish dollar that everyone used to break up into 8 different pieces, or bits, right? Bits, Bitcoin. 2 bits was a quarter, 8 was $1. And that's what they had to use, right? That's what we had to use here before, when we got out from under Britain's thumb, was the Spanish dollar. And that was okay until the 1850s. We used Spanish dollars because that was the only coins we really had. So, I guess the message to me is, like, I'm trying to figure out a way that people will be able to tolerate this, but I think it's going to have to be a real difficult fight to make sure that there's protection so Bitcoiners' lives aren't miserable. And that's what I'm hoping that we can eventually accomplish. And it's no small order, but I don't see any other way of avoiding what Kennedy talked about when he said, he thinks there's going to be a new executive order to seize people's Bitcoin. So, the solution to that is get it into an amendment. And if they want to add gold to it or whatever, Bitcoin gold, things like that, that's okay. But look, Bitcoin is the new innovation. We keep talking about, like, innovation, or, all the shitty coins, talk about we need to improve upon it. Bitcoin's a pretty good value proposition on a lot of fronts. And essentially, I think what you're seeing the government that's going to spend millions and millions of our taxpayer dollars on is, how do we recreate Lightning? They're going to come back to realize, well, Lightning's perfect for what they're trying to do. But they're still going to spend the money to try to figure it out their own way first.
Yeah, exactly. Because, it all comes down to money politics, right? It's like the way that the current system is structured, specifically the bureaucracy, is that it needs total control of money. And it really, it kind of reminds me of, the theory of the sovereign individual. And by the way, you mentioned Natalie. She is so freaking smart. She blew my mind when she came on the show. couple weeks ago. Holy cow. She's absolutely brilliant. So I'm really glad that you guys are working together, and I'm really, really glad that she's on our side. I just want to give a shout out real quick, but it kind of reminds me of the theory from the sovereign individual, which is the basically theorizing that, you know, the end of the nation state, the end of the nation state model, and it ends in fiscal crisis as more and more people choose to opt out of inflationary money. And I joke about this with Opti all the time. But, you know, there's always truth to every joke, right? I said, look, we're going to hold it. We're going to try to hold it down. Obviously, you know, I live in a pretty friendly Bitcoin state. I live in Florida, right? But, you know, if all else fails, I'm going to move to El Salvador, right? And I know that a lot of other Bitcoiners are going to follow suit. And their ability to seize or confiscate wealth like they did with the 6102 order is greatly diminished, especially if you have people taking self-custody. It's very, very difficult for them to do on a massive scale. And then I guess maybe it's naive of me to say this, but maybe in the long term that forces governments to really change or change the way that they're looking at the relationship with citizens. Because you're just going to see a massive, you know, a massive wealth flight. I mean, you see this with every, you know, we stay as neutrals, as politically neutral as possible. But I'll put it nicely. You see this with every collectivist country, right? And specific where I'm originally from, in Venezuela, you know, you saw a massive flight. You saw a brain drain. You saw millions of people leave the country, right? You saw the most successful entrepreneurs, the businessmen, the wealth leave the country, because it was a terrible jurisdiction to do business with, to do business in, and to find economic opportunity and prosperity. And I think that you might see that in the future, specifically if the U.S. drops the ball when it comes to Bitcoin, right? I don't know if you saw this, but there was a recent article with Bloomberg basically saying that Hong Kong, with the approval of the CCP, was actually trying to incentivize Bitcoin and shitcoin companies to, you know how crazy that sounds, right? After the mining ban, to try to incentivize Bitcoin companies to move to Hong Kong, right? So I think that US policymakers and regulators don't quite understand that this, this geographical monopoly advantage that they once have, if I said that correctly, it doesn't work with Bitcoin. Bitcoin lives in cyberspace. We're just going to go to where we're treated best. Why would we stay? Why would we stay here? You know, so I don't know. I just don't want to go through that. You know, like I'd rather stay here, you know? And I think that's where, you know, people like yourself, Jason, that's why you guys are so important in the fight that you guys are, the fight that you guys are doing. So what is the next step here? What, you know, is this a lost cause? I guess my question is to you.
I don't think it's a lost cause, because we do have, every 4 years we get a chance to elect a new administration. I mean, how could there not be hope? We have a Kennedy who said, basically, this is the plan of the government, and you know, he's going to force the Democratic Party to reconsider if he does well. Maybe he doesn't become the candidate, to rethink the platform. This government moves slowly, but at the end of the day, there has been a resiliency in the United States to focus on people's freedoms and liberties. And I think there's what you saw, you know, when you mentioned the Restrict Act, right? You saw the backlash about that as people really understood it, even though senators had signed on to it. And now that thing's stalled out. You know, I mean, it's not, there has not been one person in the House of Representatives willing to introduce that as a companion bill. That's a big red flag to the Restrict Act, because you have 26 senators who signed on to it. So when people started speaking up, that's when they said, wait a minute, yeah, this isn't maybe the best way to go about it. Maybe we need to make some changes. And typically you almost automatically have one of 435 House of Representative members who's willing to say, oh yeah, I'll do a, you know, companion bill in the House and introduce it since it's introduced in the Senate. So I'm hoping the collective intelligence of our country is enough where we've set up this experiment called democracy, to potentially stop what is happening with totalitarian governments. And I think that You know, the if you look at the price of Bitcoin now, in the United States, it's almost a good indication, right? Because of all the pressures they're putting on Bitcoin, people are like doubling down, buying it more. I think there's hope. I think though that at some point or another, and I don't know how we do this, I really don't, is we have to sort of find a way for Bitcoiners to get together in a common way, maybe similar to like the NRA or the, the Association for Retired People. So it's, it doesn't be one party or the other, and just make it really clear, like how we feel, what we believe in. And there should be room for this. I love that you brought up the sovereign individual, because that's, to me, that's where we are at, right? We are, back to communities online. There's different ways people, we're now in demand, right? The people should want us to move from one country to another. And look, history tells me it's going to be a very difficult thing. So I can't tell you that it's going to turn out okay. It very well may be that people who are Bitcoiners have to leave the United States, because this is definitely a knockout, drag out battle. And there's the people in power are the ones that are in power, right? That have a lot of tools in their toolkit to stop these things. So this is, this to me is like really a David versus Goliath. But I do think as people realize things, as you explaining it to the people you elect, congressman, congresswoman, Bitcoin's important to you. That's, remember, it's about votes, and that's to me why even the fraudster Sam Bankman-Fried couldn't fool everybody all of the time, right? So we just have to find a way to make our voice heard. And there's great things that the Bitcoin Policy Institute is working on that, with David Zell you had on, and I love supporting that. They're doing their conference at the end of this month that I'm, been invited to speak at. So, it's just going to have to be persistent effort. Just, your show, things that we keep on talking about it, because at the end of the day, it's not like currency. It's not like tanks right now. It's still based on votes, that people get into power. So.
Yeah. And then let's talk about that a little bit, because I think that subject is deaf on Bitcoiners. Bitcoiners they underestimate the importance of the political process, right? They underestimate the other side understands it very, very well, right? They're playing to win. And what I see with Bitcoiners a lot, right, is this idea of my wealth is in Bitcoin. I don't care. I'm fine, which on an individual level, to be very clear, if you take Bitcoin into self-custody, yeah, you are definitely at an advantage for sure, right? If all else fails, you can leave, right? But I don't know. I like the States. As a first generation American, I was sold on what the idea of this country is and what it represented. And the original vision of the founding fathers of what the U.S. should be is very extremely coincidentally also very aligned with Bitcoin and the way that Bitcoin works, right? So it's almost as if we need to go back to what it once was, not what it became after the introduction of the Federal Reserve in 1913, right? And for that, in order for that to happen, Jason, there needs to be a political movement. And I think a lot of people shy away from the political movement side of things because of, you and I both know this, how difficult it is to effectuate change politically. And I think you mentioned the NRA, right? Like, try passing a gun law. Try it. It's literally almost impossible. And Corey Clipston wrote a great piece, Race to Avoid the War. He was talking about a 10 million to 11 million transigent, I can't pronounce it correctly, but this minority of Bitcoiners that they will not budge on this issue. And I think if we're able to capture that, we might not have to move to El Salvador, right? But there needs to be a political process. I think the politics need to be involved. I think people need to get active here, and they need to be able to elect into office people that are pro-Bitcoin. Right. I think that's the way. I think that's the way that we really protect ourselves in this particular situation, because as it stands right now, we have a good portion, a large amount of elected officials, I might add, that are hell bent on stopping this dead in its tracks. I mean, Elizabeth Warren made it part of her campaign. She's like, I'm building an anti-crypto. She's declaring war. Like, she's literally saying this is not going to happen on my watch. And please correct me if I'm wrong here, Jason. She sits on the Senate Banking Committee, doesn't she?
She certainly does.
Yeah. Yeah.
Certainly does. And she's had a lot of influence, probably oversized influence, at the White House as well. One of her disciples, Rohit Chopra, is head of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, which is a major agency. So there's, yeah, that's unfortunate to see that. I mean, when she did the war on Wall Street and Occupy Wall Street, I think that was, people understood that. But like, what, first of all, the conversations you and I are having, like the fact that we're able to have them, in this country and it's a reminder to me of a little bit of like the Federalist Papers, because those were done anonymously. Like when you hear what we're talking about, if you didn't know we were talking about Bitcoin, you'd think we're just a couple of crazy people, like paranoid the government's coming to take our stuff. And so that makes us sound like a little bit like we're, Bitcoiners who just want to keep things the way they are. The problem I think that we're going to run into is the biggest problem is going to be, I think, the Bitcoiners and I hear this almost all the time when they'll say something like, Jason, it's great what you're doing, but you're really just wasting your time. I'm getting Bitcoin because I don't want to deal with all the politicians. I'm just going to, not show up. And I don't want to, that's the reason I have Bitcoin is because I don't want to deal with the government. Well, the problem is the government wants to deal with you. You know what I mean? So you can ignore the 800-pound gorilla on the other side of the room and try to like read your book, but you're probably going to be disturbed at some point. And so I think there has to be a realization we got to do something about that 800-pound gorilla.
Yeah, exactly. Anyways, I want to talk about the recent, if you don't mind pivoting, of course.
Sure. I'm already worn out, but yeah.
Yeah, these are intense conversations. The recent New York Times article came out, basically, attacking Bitcoin mining. And it's interesting because we know that that is one of the narratives that is being propagated by the White House. That is one of the narratives that is being propagated by Elizabeth Warren. That is one of the narratives that's being propagated by the state of New York, right? That Bitcoin is, environmentally damaging. I don't think it's sincere. And the reason that I don't think it's sincere is because every time they're confronted, rather than, addressing the actual concerns of the public, saying, look, I think you got this wrong, and let me tell you why they got this wrong, they gaslight you. Right? They label you, you're an extremist, you're racist, they try to shut you up, but they don't really address that. So I guess my question to you is, I don't really believe that they truly believe that Bitcoin is truly bad for the environment. I think that they just want to control what you can do with energy and what you can't do with energy. Because what about electric cars? Why are we not talking about electric cars? Electric cars are, they get their energy from, non-green sources. So how come they're not held to the same standards? Why is it that it's Bitcoin mining that is the problem?
So, proof of work is, really a remarkable event in our time where we can do what we can do. So first of all, I think a lot of times is saying, well, you're wasting a lot of energy on something that's not really useful. And I think that, to me, as soon as when you see that part of the argument, you realize how flimsy it is and how maybe insincere it is. Because why would you start by saying, well, it's like your choice. Look, you could choose to put your energy toward electric cars. You could put, gas in an SUV. Like, you've bought and paid for the energy that was there, and you're using it, as you think fit. If anything, Bitcoin is a more worthwhile enterprise than others and other types of systems to funnel your energy into. But look, the government is attacking proof of work. We also have the SEC attacking, proof of stake, right? And where they're saying these are companies, right? And it's really affecting the whole system. And there's a lot of things at play. And I think the way to think about this is not whether it's sincere or not, but there's sort of a saying in DC, and I love it when you call it the Imperial City, is you always try to figure out what everyone's end game is. So like, what's Senator Warren's end game, right? Where is she headed next? Does she want to be Treasury Secretary? Maybe, maybe she wants to run for the White House again. So this is a convenient plank, in political process to say, I think that Bitcoin energy is bad. There's evidence to say it. Behind closed doors, I'm sure she's like, who cares if it's true? It's probably not true, but I'm just going to bash it because it's getting me a lot of fundraising things, and I'm benefiting from it. So the question is, how much is Senator Warren really benefiting from this argument? And look, it is so obvious. Like you said, Senator Warren is on the Senate Banking Committee, but guess what? She's not the chair. She doesn't set the agenda. But let me tell you, when she wants to announce something, when there's a Senate hearing coming up, you will notice there is a huge New York Times article the day of the hearing for whatever bills she wants to introduce. So she's got, we talked about this at one point, almost the fourth branch of the government as like the media, so that's what the New York Times dangerously goes toward when you see stuff like this. But the reason I bring up the proof of stake is that everyone's getting attacked from all sides. Proof of stake right now, not Bitcoin, is under attack by Gary Gensler. I know a lot of people in the Bitcoin, world are like, cheering that on. I don't think we need a government policy to help Bitcoin, right? So we don't need to have them bashed, but it's understand Gary Gensler is trying to shave, his whole, history, what people are going to think of him in this SEC is getting crypto under control. He's already said Bitcoin can do what it wants. It's over as a commodity. So he's not going to go after Bitcoin because he knows he can't win that argument. But so he's going after the proof of stake one. So that's what I mean about why we have these unprecedented times because what are we attacking really? We're attacking the way we come up with the security of the network. And we know the Bitcoin security network works. We have almost 15 years now to prove it. So I don't, whether it's insincere or not, and this is kind of, maybe not that positive a way of thinking about what politicians do, but I don't think they care whether it really affects the energy or not. It's just a good talking point.
Yeah, it's a good talking point, and it's a mechanism. It's a mechanism to basically accumulate power. Like it's not really about what's true, what isn't true. And you said something really interesting about the New York Times. This is something that we covered on Simply Bitcoin Live, which is our daily live show, is that the New York Times, they have a history. I mean, they sold the American public, which, now we know in hindsight, now we know that they sold the American public that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Now we know that it was the Intelligence Committee that was feeding that journal. I forget, I know her first name is Judith, but the Intelligence Committee was feeding her that narrative. So it's absolutely crazy that we're living through this time where, the internet has given the common man the ability to communicate directly. Look at what we're doing right now, right? These conversations would not be possible a decade ago or 2 decades ago. We would be labeled as, you already said it, crazy conspiracy theorists, right? But it's just crazy. It's crazy time. So Jason, we have about 5 minutes left. What does the next 5 years look like to you? What's going to happen? What are things on your radar that worry you? And I guess I'll leave it at that, and then I'll follow up with another question.
So 5 years from now, I think that we'll have seen the next halving cycle of Bitcoin. Bitcoin will probably be a lot higher in value than it is today. I think you'll see people start to make the choice to go to El Salvador and other countries, because I think you will see has the ultimate weapon to really discourage people to hold on to something, which is taxation. So I think that what you'll see start to be implemented is a taxation scheme against Bitcoin, particularly as the value goes up. That makes it almost unreasonable to hold it. And that goes beyond like if you have it in self-custody or anything. So
even if you don't sell it,
because there's this how it's valued, and we'll see. But look, the IRS has already noted that they feel like they can get more money from this industry that's out there. So the easiest way to really shut something down, or at least control it, is to heavily tax it. So I think you'll see, yeah, the unrealized gains, and that's I think the biggest threat. I don't, these other things we're talking about, it's like right here, right now, it's right in front of us. We hear Senator Warren's rhetoric. I don't know who's going to win in 2024, but I think you're going to see enough of a change where this whole, specifically the energy thing, will die down, and we'll move on to other things. It'll always be out there. But just remember, like, President Biden, like, for all everyone says, like, it's not the worst administration in the world, but he's an odd duck. Okay. He cares about the climate so much. And that's where you see this energy focus come from. Because somehow, of course, we know that it was the FUD got up to that level where people said, oh yeah, look, Bitcoin could be a threat. We have to stop that, because President Biden, no matter what, he wants to make sure, climate change is under control. So I do think, we could see a change of administration in 2024. And that's what this country's about. I think right now we're at a heavy pressure. And I think that by 2024, when we do the halving and move into 2025, things will start to get better. Bitcoin will start to get more valuable. But again, I think people will start, not so much for the, liberty aspect of things of holding Bitcoin, but when you sort of see like what California did, right? Everyone's fleeing California because of the high taxes. You might see that at a federal basis.
Yeah. I hate to see it, but I have a feeling, my gut, my intuition is telling me we are definitely heading down that path. It's way too beneficial for the administrative state, the deep state, to give up the privilege of issuing money for free that everyone else has to work for. It's way too beneficial for them. I don't think they're just going to hand over the key, say, hey guys, look, better money, here you go, goodbye, we're leaving. I don't think they'll do that. So anyways, Jason, I really enjoyed this conversation. I know it was pretty heavy. This is pretty heavy, but I thoroughly enjoyed it, and really appreciate you joining me today. Why don't you tell everybody where they could find you on the interwebs?
Easiest is at Regulatory Jason on Twitter. DM me there, and I'll be at the Bitcoin conference in Miami, so definitely hit me up there as well.
And I will see you there as well. All right, guys, thank you so much for tuning in to another episode of Simply Bitcoin IRL. We'll be back tomorrow at 12:15 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for Simply Bitcoin Live. Love you all. Take self-custody of your Bitcoin. We will win this thing. See you guys later.